Hello, my name is Rowan Musa. Scott Henderson, Matt Grenier, and I will be presenting The Economic Theory of a Common Property Resource, the Fishery, a paper by Scott Gordon that examines the economic theory of natural resource utilization as it pertains to the fishing industry. Now, although we will be discussing fisheries, the theory Gordon offers is generally applicable to all cases where natural resources are owned in common and exploited under conditions of individualistic competition, such as the petroleum industry. To start, I will give a brief overview of some concepts which will be relevant to our discussion. The open access problem resulting from common property resources has been illustrated in Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, where individual selfishness inevitably prevails over the needs of society, so that each man increases his herd without limit in a world that is inherently limited. But why would people knowingly damage a resource they depend on? This catch-22 situation occurs because the benefits of exploitation are private while its costs are externalized. One way to address the open access problem is through government-imposed economic rent in the form of a tax or a fee to make users of common property resources internalize some harmful externality, such as degradation, while simultaneously generating a long-run economic profit. In Chapter 3, we use New England Bay as an example, a territory belonging to the British government. However, what happens when we are in a disputed area such as the East China Sea, with claims from China, South Korea, and Japan? How do we collect economic rent on the middle of the Pacific? The fact that natural resources of the sea yield no economic rent is what Gordon believes to be at the root of issues such as overexploitation that surrounding the fishery. We turn to biology because that is where the bulk of research has been done. There is some recognition of the economic or utilitarian value for managing fisheries, notably by Dr. Birkenrode, who regarded management of fisheries to be for the benefit of man more so than for the fish. However, despite the great amount of research undertaken by biologists, there has been little focus on economic concepts and an even lesser use of analytical tools of economic theory. The locus of biological literature has been determining the effect of fishing on fish population, and this has been part of an effort to design regulative policies for conservation. Yet this effort has been marred by problems, first of which being the immense reproductive potential of fish. In 1939, the Canadian Board of Fisheries conducted an experiment where they tried to kill all the fish in a small lake by poisoning the water, only to return 2 years later and find over 90,000 fish still in the lake. Life in the sea reflects the Malthusian law of population, where fish, at the mercy of constant predation and a narrow margin of food supply, have no power to alter environmental conditions and consequently cannot progress. Does that mean that human activity has no effect on fish populations? To answer, fishery biologists conducted investigations to determine the age distribution of catches. Catches are heavily affected by good and bad brood years. A good year is favorable to the hatching of eggs and their survival, and has positive effects on future catches. Because large broods do not depend on large numbers of adult fish, this could mean that fish populations are unaffected by anthropogenic activity. However, there has been evidence to the contrary, with post-World War II European waters seeing a significant growth in fish population, indicating that fishing might cause greater mortality than previously thought. It is unsurprising then the cyclical pattern general opinion seems to have taken, with arguments against all restrictive measures on the basis of inexhaustible nature of fishery resources, and on the other hand ensuing restrictions driven by concerns of depletion. In formulating governmental policy, a major struggle for biologists appears to be oversimplifying the problem. The propagation theory proposes a legal size limit so that every individual of a species can spawn at least once. This theory, however, has been largely disputed by the fact that fisheries taking large quantities of pre-spawning fish year after year have seen no effect on their landings. The thinning theory argues that thinning out young fish by fishing would enable the rest to grow more rapidly. However, transplanting experiments which supposedly support this theory do not take into account elements of natural ecology, thus also being plagued by oversimplifications. Barnough's theory stands the most sound. deciding that if a species were in ecological equilibrium before commercial fishing, human interference would have the same effect as any predator. The population would reach a new equilibrium at a lower level of abundance, and with a divergence between the two equilibria depending on the degree of human effort and efficacy. Fishery management has become a more popular approach to problems such as depletion. It focuses attention on the quantity of fish caught as to derive the largest sustainable catch, thereby referencing economic considerations and treating the problem as one of human use of natural resources. However, again, there is a negligence of economic concepts. Factors of production used up in fishing are not taken into account as costs, net economic yield is scarcely referenced, and fishermen are treated as an exogenous element, and their behavior is not integrated into models. In the following section, Scott addresses this shortage by applying the ecological equilibrium theory to the fishing industry, thereby showing us that the overfishing problem is a result of the economic organization of the industry.
Moving on from a biological framework, we'll now dive into an economic analysis. The economic theory of this paper is developed for fish that never leave the area they were born, such as cod or haddock. This condition allows each fishing ground to be analyzed in isolation. We will first look at a simple economic model of one fishing ground. The vertical axis is measured in dollars. Fishing effort on the horizontal axis can be thought of as the number of boats operating in this particular fishing ground. MP stands for marginal productivity. It measures the benefit to society. AP stands for average productivity. It measures the private benefit to each individual boat. In the model, both the social and private benefits are downward sloping because the fish population decreases as more boats enter the fishing ground. This makes each subsequent boat less productive than the last. MC stands for marginal cost. It measures the cost to society. AC stands for average cost. It measures the private cost to each individual boat. Social and private costs are equal and do not change with the quantity of boats, as this is just one small fishing ground. The amount of boats, denoted by X in the graph, represents the optimal amount of boats for this society. Past the point X, the benefit to society is less than the cost of sending out another boat. The shaded area on the graph illustrates the total profit, or benefits minus cost, to society at this optimal level. Without any regulation, however, this is not the equilibrium outcome of this model. The reason for this will be explained in the following section. Now let's introduce another fishing ground in the same region and call it Ground 2. Ground 2 is less productive than Ground 1 for any level of fishing effort. The horizontal line C represents both the social and private cost. The amount of boats represented by X and Y in each fishing ground will maximize the total profit for the entire region. Again, this does not represent an equilibrium level, which begs the question. In both the previous cases, if the socially optimal level of fishing is not the equilibrium, what is? We can illustrate using the two-ground example. Starting from the socially optimal level, with X boats in Ground 1 and Y boats in Ground 2, consider the choice of a fisherman at the port deciding what to do. Their options are A, go to Ground 1, B, go to Ground 2, or C, don't leave the port. Option C is the only option that is beneficial to society, but the fisherman doesn't care. It is in the fisherman's best interest to go where the maximum private profit can be made, regardless of the social outcomes. Maximizing private profit, which is the difference between A, P, and C in each graph, they will choose option A, go to Ground 1. The same choice will be made by each subsequent fisherman until the private benefit, AP, is equal for both grounds. At this point, the fishermen are indifferent between heading to Ground 1 or 2, but still prefer one of these over staying home. The choice to stay home will only be reached once the private benefit is equal to the private cost in both grounds, or where the line C intersects with the line AP. This is the equilibrium point of the model, where total profit to society is 0. Fishermen, by simply acting in their own interests, have erased all profits from the fishing industry. Now, what does this imply for policy implementation? Simply put, regulation of the fishing industry is necessary to achieve the socially optimal level of fishing. So what kind of regulations would fix this problem? Historically, fishing regulations have only been concerned with biological factors, essentially ignoring the outcomes for the humans relying on the industry for their livelihoods. An example of this is the Pacific halibut case. To summarize this case, a fixed catch limit was introduced for the Pacific halibut fishery during the early 1930s under an international agreement between the US and Canada. This policy meant that each season, fishermen could catch as many halibut as they wished until a certain overall quota was reached. Primarily concerned with the growth in fish populations, the policy was deemed a success, as stocks of halibut did increase in the years following the implementation of the policy. However, there was no evidence of benefits to fishermen themselves. Since they had to cease operations for the rest of the season once the catch limit had been reached, a competitive race for halibut was created. As a result, halibut season in the Pacific went from being 6 months long in 1933 to just 26 days long in 1952. To compete in this race, fishermen invested heavily in better equipment, including faster boats and better nets, to remain competitive during a shorter season. Naturally, this increased investment led to a rise in average costs. The increase in halibut population was offset by a rise in costs, leaving fishermen no better off than before. This example illustrates the importance of incorporating economic considerations into the evaluation of alternative policies in a common property resource industry like the fishery. The rest of this paper works with an integrated model, taking the biological concern with the depletion of the fish population and incorporating the economic outcomes for both the fishermen and society. This combined model is coined by the paper as the Bionomic Model. This model can be approached in terms of two problems. The first requires investigation into the unregulated equilibrium of the industry. In the previous example, we found that this level is that at which total profits are equal to zero. The second problem looks to answer the question, what is the socially optimal level of fishing? Let's first solve problem one by finding the unregulated equilibrium. The bionomic ecosystem can be expressed in terms of four variables as follows. P is the total population of a certain fish species. L is the total value of fish caught or landed by fishermen. E is the fishing effort expended. Remember from our previous example that this can be thought of as the number of fishing boats operating in any given fishing ground or region. C is the total cost of fishing. The three segments to this graph, labeled 1, 2, and 3, respectively, show the relationships of these four variables. Segment 1 shows how the fish population is decreasing as fishing effort increases. We will see later why without this relationship, an equilibrium cannot be reached. Segment 2 shows the number of boats needed to land a certain level of fish, given a certain population. For example, if the population were represented by the line P3, the effort level E would be needed to catch L fish. Segment 3 shows how total cost is increasing at a constant rate as the number of boats increases. Now, to show the relationship between them, let's work through the segments. Beginning in segment 1, an arbitrary level of landings L is chosen. The corresponding fish population P is then found. This population level P is represented by one of the population lines in the segment 2 production function. In this example, population P is illustrated by the line P3. Given this information, we can now find the amount of boats E needed to land the arbitrary level of L. Moving to segment 3, the total cost of this number of boats E is represented by C. The goal of this process is to reach the unregulated equilibrium for the fishing ground. This occurs where the total cost C is equal to the total value of the landings L. For the purpose of this equilibrium, segment 1 is essential because it creates diminishing return on total landings. Mac will now go into further detail.
Before we get into diminishing returns, we need to establish that linearity does not mean that there will be an equilibrium. The condition that landings is equal to cost is required for an equilibrium, that is, that it's needed for any kind of stop measure for open access fishing, but just because they are both linear does not mean that they coincide and an equilibrium will be reached. Evident from the graph presented, we can have two possible scenarios that both exhibit perfect linearity and effort undergone, but not reach an equilibrium. In the case of L1, the landing or catch of fish is below the costs undergone to catch the fish. If we hold the assumption that those leaving the markets are not impacting the landings of others, which is necessary for the linearity of the landing, we can see that no matter how many leave, the landing will never exceed the cost and there is infinite exit from the industry. The other case occurs with L2. When the landing to effort ratio is greater than the cost to effort ratio, there then will be infinite entry. One fisher profits the difference between the landing and catch at any given effort, but so does any new fisher to the industry. This condition produces profit at all levels of effort, and profit is increasing in effort, so you would, in theory, see an infinite effort be put into fishing, either by those who are already in the industry, fishing day and night, or by infinite entry into the industry. To break from this, and to ensure an intersection of landing and costs, we add the law of diminishing returns. It makes sense logically. If we think that there is some kind of population of fish, and the more people get involved in fishing, landing per effort will decline as the population of fish declines from taking the previous fish. We don't actually need to even assume linear or diminishing returns in the landing function. We could assume increasing costs in the cost function. We can imagine that there's a docking fee associated with docking your fishing boats in a particular marina. We can see that as demand for these spots increase, as effort increases, which will drive up the cost to fishing. This would give a positive second derivative of the cost curve and make it curve upwards. For this purposes, we're going to be focusing on the diminishing returns of the landing function, but it could be used as increasing costs as well. Even if we have this condition of diminishing returns on the landing function, we need to ensure that the landing function lies above the cost function at some point. Otherwise, we may have a case where the landing function, although concave down, never actually intersects with the cost function. Just as with the previous slide, we can imagine that as effort increases, it shifts populations from P7 towards P1, indicating that at any given population of fish, the effort to land a specific number of fish is increasing. Under the profit maximizing maxim, the optimal would be E prime L prime, where the marginal catch is equal to the marginal cost. We, of course, are looking at this problem from an open access point of view, so the optimal becomes EL, where the landing function intersects the cost function, taking all resource rents from the industry. We can also treat P, the population of fish, as a function of A, which is some natural maximum population of fish based on all kinds of factors, like available food, the water temperatures, predator populations, and a whole lot more. We take this A, subtract BL, which is a depletion coefficient, times the landing, where fish are actually removed from the population. A high B value suggests that any landing of fish is very damaging to the overall population. We can picture A as being influenced through conservation efforts or breeding preservation practices, whereas B might be influenced through some form of catch and release or size requirements on the fish caught. Say if a fish below a certain size has not undergone spawning, like that they are still babies or juveniles or something, they should not be removed from the population so that the landings do not impact the overall population as drastically. The landing function is a function of CEP, which is a productivity coefficient times the effort put into the fishing and the population of fish. For a desired fixed landing of fish, increases in C means either less population is required to reach it, or less effort is need to be put in. A lower value of C means, of course, the opposite. C can be thought of as efficiency. We can think of it being influenced through new technologies or new techniques in fishing. At the optimum, we can look at comparative statics around impacts to effort, one of the most easily controllable human aspects of fishing. We see that as A increases, the natural population of fish, effort is increased as the landing curve will now intersect the cost curve at a higher level of effort. As B increases, effort will decrease because the landing function will have a stronger diminishing returns effect, intersecting the cost curve at a lower level of E. The effects of C are ambiguous. Increasing C yields a higher landing, which may encourage more effort to maximize profit or discourage effort as fishing is now more efficient at any given level of effort. The landing curve may now intersect the cost curve at any higher or lower levels of effort. So that's it for a cover of the paper, but we do have our next questions to ask you. So Gordon believes that the main issue surrounding the overexploitation of resources of the sea is that we cannot impose economic rent. How should we deal with the open access problem posed by common property resources when we are not able to impose economic rent? And question number 2 is, have you or your community ever experienced an open access problem? What was the solution? If there has been no solution, why do you think the issue had not been resolved?